Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. Today I'm going to be breaking down my top 10 picks for the NAIC, the largest tournament of the year. It's a tournament that I'm not actually attending, but I'll be watching on the sidelines. We've seen some really interesting results, even this weekend at Origins and over in Sweden. We saw some tweaks to some very powerful archetypes that we already have established in the format, and we're also seeing some brand new stuff come out of the woodwork as well in some cases. So, going to be an interesting rundown. The list is mainly made up of the points earned from this Sun and Moon up to Unbroken Bonds format. So, there is a bit of opinion, but mostly it is based on a list from championship points earned. But as I said, there may be a few things shuffled around based on my personal preferences as well, so we'll go through that. As always, first of all, something to keep an eye on throughout the video is you can check out the popularity and number of votes each deck got from the community. I posed this poll into a popular Facebook group in Hey Fonte, and I got a bunch of responses, so thank you to everyone who do respond to these. It's actually very helpful for the video, and it gives you some extra scope of what the general consensus is on these archetypes. Do they think they're good, bad, and what you really expect to see when you turn up to an event is really based off of the general consensus. So don't just take my word for it, also check out that rank in the top left corner of the screen. With that said, let's jump into our number 10, which is actually a new archetype that came out of this weekend. It's a dark box archetype. I don't really know the best way to put it. It's a combination of Spiritomb, Honchkrow, and Umbreon, trying to take advantage of this Jirachi Stellar Wish engine for your consistency. And it's a really interesting, mainly non-GX build. The Honchkrow comes in to give you a very strong Zoroark and Weezing matchup, because respectively both those decks are very, very reliant on special energy cards. Many Zoroark variants only play a combination of DCE and 3CE. The same can be said for Weezing, but also plays counter energies. But essentially, the Honchkrow comes into play. Your opponent can't attach any more energy cards unless they're gusting around the Honchkrow, and even then, they're put on a clock to the amount of attacks they can physically do. So, the Honchkrow, very, very strong for walling out two very popular builds right now in the game, giving you pretty strong matchups. I also feel like because you're majority of the time a non-GX build, you've got a pretty reasonable Reshizard and Blacephalon. I think it's favoured, to be honest. It feels like when they take the first prize, you're immediately getting into Umbreon doing 120 swings, and then the Spiritombs, as the turns go on, starts getting into some very strong damage, especially with Hustlebelt involved as well. His damage cap goes quite high, so definitely a card to be aware of. The deck sort of churns along in those opening turns, trying to get use of Umbreon and maybe some other non-GX pokes here and there, but the Spiritomb really does carry into the late game thanks to that building spite ability. That's what it's all about there. For close matchups, I think Pikarom and QuagNag can be awkward. I think in the case of QuagNag, it's usually who takes the first prize, and then you'll do a back and forth the entire time. Dark Box, the list that we saw Grant Manley have, it has a Mew in it, so it's not like they're going to Warlord your entire board, especially because they don't have enough gusts to keep bringing up the Mew or whatever. So you'll be safe in that regard, but it's really, it takes a while for the Spiritomb to take an initial knockout unless we find, we go first, we find a Rainbow Energy, we build Spite, and then we can knock out a Poipole or a Wooper or something. But on their side, if they go first, they can just evolve up into a Quagsire, take that first prize. And yes, you can probably respond with Umbreon and whatnot, and it just will sort of bring about a back and forth the entire game, which you can't really have much effect over other than your stadium, and hope that Black Market Prism Star sticks for a turn or whatever. But I think these sort of non-GX, whoever takes the first prize is probably going to go ahead in that game and end up winning it. Pikarom, I think, can also be awkward. Depending on how Zapdos orientated they are, it will be a much worse matchup for you. Obviously, they have a lot of Guzmas and whatnot, so they will be trying to target down that Mew and get value out of their GX attack, which could be very scary. And they have that early Zapdos pressure, which is always awkward because they'll be jumping ahead of prizes. They can be picking off Spiritombs that are starting to build Spite, which is your main pressure in the game, I guess. So that's something that you have to be aware of. And matchups you really don't want to see include the stall decks, Shedinja and Zapdos. Zapdos being the most critical one here. The Zapdos matchup is pretty poor because they are just way faster than you. The Dark Box decks basically has the same shell as Zapdos, but it's just more passive, I guess, because the Spiritomb isn't coming out the gate swinging for 80 on turn 1. In fact, you're pretty much waiting for an Umbreon to start doing your core damage in those opening turns. So Zapdos definitely a poor matchup and one you'll want to avoid if you're going to take the risk on this deck. For Decklist itself, this is very similar to Grant Manley's 60, actually. I think I changed one card. I cut a Nest Ball just for a second calm. just for... I just thought that was a better decision in the deck because you're playing, 2 stage 1s and especially the Umbreons. You never want to see them in your hand, so having recycle for those is really nice. But yeah, this is a nice shell that Grant Manley sort of showed off this weekend at Origins to a pretty respectable performance. There are a few other options that we can talk about. Obviously, this is like a 60-card sort of baseline that I'm going to try and give you for every single list. But there are some options that I've considered. Baby Buzzwole being an interesting one. Rainbow Energy to improve, Zoroark matchups and also the Pikarom matchup. Absol could give you some hope against Zapdos, but still probably pretty weak. Marshadow for hand disruption on the opponent's end. More sort of ropes and switches to improve the amount of Stellar Wishes you can get off. And also there's the opportunity to have anti-Miltex. If you want to add in a Palpad, a Monkey, a Tantalizer, and a Judge, you could in theory, recycle your stuff to the point where Spiritomb can just start, continuing to use Anguish Cry the entire time, and then you'll move in and out of your Monkey to just not lose that matchup overall and maybe be able to grind out the opponent, who knows, especially if you're able to like Palpad back in Judge and get value from it over and over again. So yeah, definitely something to bear in mind. If you want to tech for mill, this deck pretty much can do it, but it will take up a number of spaces. Into number 9, it's actually QuagNag. You'll notice that I didn't actually put this on my ranking on the Facebook page, so that's my apology. I mean, I tried to go for as many decks as possible. I think I just missed it off. But yeah, there was enough people in comments to at least give it a number of votes. It was definitely, one of those missed off type decks. I would have felt like it wouldn't have had a huge amount of votes, but I feel like definitely more than it actually ended up getting. So take that with a pinch of salt. But QuagNag still makes it onto the top 10 list. It's got a very strong Blacephalon matchup and loves to see stall because obviously Naganadel can recycle energies for you, so energy removal is not a game plan against you, and as long as you're relatively conservative with your energy cards, even like a Lugia can't get rid of too many, so you're consistently doing a good amount of pressure with QuagNag in that stall matchup, and there's not much they can do about it. Your Reshizard is also like pretty favorable, very, very good if they lead a Reshizard, but sometimes it can be a little bit more awkward, especially with those EV Snorlaxes. We actually can't one-shot them even with our Fighting Tech Pokemon, so that can help them carry for a few turns. And if they're playing Field Blower, things can get a little ugly, so it is favorable. Very, very good if they lead a Reshizard itself, but otherwise it can get a little bit closer. Speaking of close matchups, as I mentioned Dark Box earlier, Zoroark I think is also close. We do have Fighting Techs, but it's still going to get pretty rough if they're going to, muck out your Oranguru to stop you drawing additional cards throughout these turns. You are a clunky deck. They have access to Judge, they have access to Field Blower, and these are all things you're a little bit afraid of. Pikarom, also pretty awkward. Again, we have the Fighting Techs, but they're maining Double Blower at the moment, which is really, really scary for QuagNag. Especially if you're trying to lead into Onyx as being one of your main attacking presences, because they'll be taking energies off the board turn by turn, and even having those Field Blowers will be scary. Zapdos, I think, is getting much closer than it used to be. That used to be like a bragging right that QuagNag had. It was a pretty strong matchup for them, but Zapdos is now teching Kukuis a lot more often to improve their Weezing matchups and to improve their matchups against Green's Reshizard, because it means they can hit 120 against the Volks. So that in turn improves their QuagNag matchup, so something to bear in mind. For unfavorables, I found Weezing to be a little bit awkward, especially because they can spell tag around Batons, which is really scary for you. And you need to, accumulate a board state with this deck no matter what you're doing. And Shedinja is also one that you definitely don't want to see because they play Mew. We don't have many gusting effects at all. We're fairly slow, and we don't really have an answer to all these Shedinjas. So here's a baseline list. Again, I tried to take a simple base build. All of these lists will be sort of simplified lists or lists that you've seen from recent successful tournaments with maybe a few tweaks here and there just for my own personal preference. For options, there aren't actually that many for this deck. I feel like it's already trying to do so much. It's multiple stage 1s that you have to try and churn out turn by turn. You don't want to get too creative with the deck, but Countercatcher could be an additional gusting option if you want to. And also we've seen the Buzzmoser plus unit energy package over the Magikarp and Werelord be successful to a reasonable top 64 finish, I think it was. So that's also something to bear in mind. You'll notice in this list I'm playing both the Fighting Techs, Quagsire and Onyx. I think Pikarom and Zoro are enough on the radar to warrant both tech cards right now. But if you just want to play one, like your preferred one, that's absolutely fine. You can add in, fourth Nest or third Acro or even an extra Pokegear. These are all reasonable options for you. So something to bear in mind, but yeah, that's a simple baseline for QuagNag. Into number 8, we get Shedinja Control. This obviously stormed a regional early on in this season, And you can see why. It has a lot of good scalps that it can claim from this top 10 list. Some decks just simply don't have enough answers to Shedinja Control. Dark Box, QuagNag, Stall, Weezing, Reshizard. None of these archetypes have enough Guzmas, enough Field Blowers, enough Escape Ropes, even sometimes, in some cases, like enough early pressure or hand disruption to make life difficult for Shedinja. They will literally just sit there with their loop. Once they're able to Zeb Striker down their entire deck, they can get into the resource management loop and just do whatever they want to completely control the game, which is, the entire intention of this deck. For close matchups, I think Blacephalon's close, especially if you want to take a look at the Ian Robb list that did play both Field Blower and Lysander Labs. That's something that you have to be a little concerned about, especially because Blacephalon himself can simply use a Burst GX to also cheat a prize card. So they have normally 3 Guzma, 1 Burst GX, 1 Lysander Labs, 1 Field Blower. That adds up to 6. So that's really bad for Shedinja Control, especially because they can just before you establish your lock, they can still start off with like an early Mind Blown or even an early Turning Point if they lead Poipole and go first or whatever. So that's something you have to be worried about. Zoroark can also get iffy depending on the amount of Guzmas they physically play, as well as the Pal Pad they have to recycle them. It definitely becomes a difficult matchup if they do have their own Oranguru and whatnot as well. For unfavorables, I think Zapdos and Pikarom are slightly unfavored. Pikarom, again, it's playing double Field Blower from like the most popular list right now, and they're typically playing 3 to 4 Guzma as well, so that gets a little ugly. They have early pressure from Zapdos from the get-go, and they play double Let Loose, which can ruin your early game setup and maybe buy them an extra prize here or there. And just regular Zapdos is also playing those Escape Ropes in addition to 4 Guzma, mandatory. And again, they can also have things like Marshadow to make your life awkward in the early turns. So Shedinja is sort of on the radar and something that you can expect to face now in the tournament, and people are aware of that. So something to bear in mind. You'll notice this list is kind of a mishmash of the original list that we saw at the EUIC, playing that Slowking line over the Fire Energies and Persians that we actually saw. I believe it was in Madison. I've also added in the Giovanni's Exile Diglett package. It's kind of something that I've seen Pedro playing on streams, and I think that's my favored way to go. Also opens up the door for you to play a Dedenne GX in the deck, which is a pretty nice option, I believe, to help out your early game security. When you're playing 4 Great Ball, 4 Ultra Ball, you have good outs to Dede Change turn 1, which gives you better outs to Elms turn 1 and to Lily turn 1. Both these things are excellent because you get to cycle your deck early, and you also get higher odds of getting an optimal supporter, which is Lily and Elm once again. Knowing that you can Giovanni's away that Dedenne for no liability later down the line is awesome. Diglett giving you underground work for some pressure with Giovanni's Exile to be more of an active mill alongside Memory Melt. From there, it's a pretty standard shell of the archetype. For some other options, we've seen the Trumbeak Hiker as the alternative to Memory Melt, something you can go for. Make and Pay Persian, as mentioned, it allows you to play some Fire Energies, which is good for taking advantage of Heat Factory, which is something worth noting. Mars is also a supporter card that can try and actively mill the opponent, whilst also cheesing cards out of their hand. If they're trying to hold on to Field Blowers and Guzmas for optimal turns, you can maybe randomly get rid of one. Crushing an Enhanced Hammer could really help, especially if you're up against Oranguru looping style decks, alongside that Faber. Tapu Lele GX may be better than Dedenne. I'm kind of trying out the Dedenne right now with the intention that it's kind of like using an Ingo and Emmet in a Pokemon, because you're just dumping and drawing a bunch to really thin your deck early. So that's why I'm going for Dedenne over Lele, but it's something that you maybe even want to play both as an option, really. Seeing as though you are already playing the Giovanni's, you can really get away with it. And then also just playing additional Ingo and Emmets yourselves could also be a way that you could start cycling that deck early, working towards more sprints and whatnot on turn 2, which could be pretty reasonable for you. Right now, I still am backing the Elm. I think it's the safest way to go when you're playing 4 Great, 4 Ultra, 3 Acro, and Dedenne, and 4 Zeb Striker themselves. You have really good odds of finding Zebra turn 2 and starting to get rolling with these sprints. So that's what I'm all about. And yeah, I think this archetype is one that you shouldn't completely forget about and still be aware of the amount of Guzmas and Blowers you're going to have access to at the NAIC. Into number 7, we get to Weezing. It's pretty surprising. This was pretty hyped after the first couple of weekends, but it seems to have dipped a little bit as more and more people have become accustomed to playing against Weezing, for one thing, and also just some natural techs have come into the format. Like I said, Shedinja Control has led to more Field Blower, hurting Weezing's damage output a little bit. because they get around spell tags a lot more often and have more answers to Shrine. Additionally, there's things like Stealthy Hood that have come into lists to improve Vileplume matchups and give certain decks an answer to beating Vileplume, and that in turn can turn off the detention gas from Weezing. So more awareness of this archetype has made life a little bit more awkward for it. That being said, it still had some reasonable performances, making a good amount of day 2s, although not progressing too far in those day 2s themselves. It's still got reasonable shovings, so it's definitely an archetype that can like beat any one of these decks on the list, other than like your very unfavorables, I would say. And it's really down to how your opponent tries to play around you and really how their hand cooperates with them. I found many occasions where you can, in theory, have like a good amount of text for Weezing in your deck, but you end up having to put down an extra Lele. You end up having to play a Marshadow to like reset your hand and stuff. Sometimes you just don't draw the right combo of cards, and Weezing can just grab free wins off of that alone. So definitely like a hidden threat with Weezing, because it's not only like the matchups on paper, it's kind of like the opponent has to draw pretty well to beat Weezing anyway, even if they have like the necessary tools to beat them. I think for favorables, QuagNag is naturally pretty good, as is Blacephalon, and I think Zapdos is also one of those things you're trying to prey on more than most. Pikarom and Reshizard are kind of close, I think. Again, it's kind of based on how these decks try to manage their board. Reshizard either is playing Green's engine with a combination of Acerola, Max Potion, or sometimes even mixed herbs now coming into the format. And there's also the Moo Milk Milk Tank, which can heal up against Weezing as well. And Pikarom plays double blower, but sometimes it ends up having to use, you know, a bunch of Dedenne in those opening turns. Even like one Dedenne can be really awkward for them for the overall prize race. And obviously Weezing is having some non-GX tech Pokemon, the likes of Larvitar, the likes of Mimikyu, the likes of Frost Rotom, for those two tag team matchups for big knockouts. Zoroark, I think, is naturally a little unfavored. They have the heals. They have Acerola Palpad at the very least. Those two one-offs. More often than not, it is just a one count of Acerola now to make life a little bit better for Weezing. But even that can be pretty awkward for you, and especially if they're playing things like Persian and whatnot, they don't have to fill out their bench too much just to maintain Riotous Beating anymore, so that's something to bear in mind. For very unfavorables, I would say Shedinja. You don't really have much answer to them. They're going to put down a Mew, and they play Champions Festival that they can loop with their Oranguru, so they'll just eventually be at a point where you're not dealing any damage to them, which is really rough, outside of just hitting their active 40. So yeah, Dark Box also will be very unfavourable for you, because they're going to Honchkrow you out the game, and then you're left just trying to detention gas whatever's left on their field. Honchkrow, of course, not getting hit by that. And Stall also is very difficult for you. If they just Frying Pan, Ilucario, Melmetal, it's once again down to detention gassing turn by turn, and they have Acerolas and Max Potions galore, so things get rough for you. Onto the list, again, try to have a pretty vanilla baseline for this deck. Some other options that I've seen: Escape Rope for additional switching. I'm at the moment only playing one Tantalizer, so getting you like into that magical swap turn, giving yourself like one more detention gas can sometimes be very, very valuable to really help you get over the line in those latter stages. Palpad is an interesting one. Again, you're just playing one Guzma, just one Tantalizer. Instead of trying to up counts in both departments, maybe just adding in one Palpad could be an option. Zebstrike is one that I've seen, which is pretty interesting. It can definitely improve your Zoro matchup, because you're a lot less worried about Muck, because the deck does rely on making itself down to a low hand size and instructing a good amount of time throughout the game. And Ditto Prism Star is another one that you could consider, just to help yourself out a little bit against prizing and just having early access to Coughings to get yourself rolling with detention gas, because with this archetype, it's not enough to just have one Weezing on the go. You want to have two Weezings in play, so that once the active gets knocked out, you can promote a new one to continue your detention gas going into, you know, your turn. So having that Ditto could allow you, you know, just extra outs and extra Coughings throughout the entire game, making you a little bit less reliant on Rescue Stretcher. Speaking of which, I'm a big fan of playing Triple Stretcher in this archetype. It means that your tech card is often reusable when you need to in the matchups where it's going to be good. The likes of Larvitar, the likes of Frost Rotom, and it means that you can easily have a very, very good chain of Weezings throughout the entire game, which I also think is vital to ensure the amount of detention gas is like the highest possible. In at number 6, we have Stalling Variants. Stalls change like a good amount, as we've seen from Unbroken Bonds, but we're seeing all sorts of variants right now. All do pretty well. We've seen Vileplume early on, and then The addition of Stealthy Hood came into a bunch of decks. Now we're sort of in that strange middle ground where people are aware of Vileplume, but it's kind of gone away for a little bit. So will they, won't they tech for it? For the NAIC, it's something that people have to be a little bit concerned about, and maybe Plume will kind of go under the radar, or maybe it'll be over-teched for. It really does depend on where these stall players want to sort of dedicate their deck slots to. We've recently seen it do very well in Sweden with Sander, a very accustomed stall player. It's his main motivation in Pokemon is to play stalling archetypes, and he's once again found a way to make the archetype work at the highest level right now, which is incredible. For stall, it has some very unfavorables and very favorables. That's the nature of this deck. Sometimes they have the answers, sometimes they don't. So the likes of QuagNag and Shedinja are the ones you really don't want to face. Shedinja can start memory melting away your Lusamine loop, and they can actually end up, at least tying with you. If not, you can actually deck out against them, which is kind of bizarre. And QuagNag is also very awkward for you. You want to feast on these Weezings, the Dark Box, the Zoroark, and Zapdos. I think they're almost all very, very favorable for you. Close matchups include Blacephalon, Reshizard, and Pikarom. They all have an element of energy recovery and acceleration. They all have Let Loose as well, which is also a bit of a factor to bear in mind. And, Pikarom has some non-GX presence. Reshizard has non-GX presence, as does Blacephalon. So it really does depend on how teched these middle three archetypes are to how strong the matchup is. If they have, a Shining Lugia in addition to an Arcanine, or if they're playing a Turtonator, something that can get around the likes of Bronzong or Araquanid. If they have answers to Vileplume, if they're playing Stealthy Hood, if they're playing Evolutions, if Pikarom's playing more than just, Zapdos and stuff like that, if they're trying to just load up their Prism Star Tapu Koko that you can Lugia away or whatever, things can get rough for them. So there's this back and forth between stall. They'll change their answers based on what the popular consensus is of what's on the radar. So that's something that they really have to try and navigate to make themselves have the best matchup possible. Here is, as I said, Sanders. I believe it was a top 4 list. I'm not going to go into too much detail about his card decisions. Just know that he's put a lot of thought into this archetype, and I'm sure this is what he believes is the most optimal 60. There's got a lot of interesting options in here. It's got the fighting stack attacker as well as the white Kyurem as literally attacking presences in this archetype. You can counter energy plus counter gain to knock out some big threats. For example, a Reshizard that's commit too many energies, or in stack attacker's case, it can be an EV Snorlax, or it can be a a Pikarom that commits too many energies to it. You can really try and punish people with these cool plays. Of course, you have Tantalizer to move your way into the active, which is pretty cool. It's got the normal package of Hooper and Regigigas. It's got Lucario and Melmetal as a tanking option, and it's playing the Bronzong at the moment for Heat Proof. I think the mentality is that Heat Proof is obviously taking up a lot less slots than Vileplume, but also more often than not, people's answers come in the form of Arcanine or Baby Volk in the case of Reshizard, and Bronzong obviously is denying both of those. So it may force Reshizard players to reassess their tech basics and even their stage 1 if it's worth it or not anymore, because obviously they have to rise to this Bronzong. For other options, you could go down the Vileplume route if you really wanted to. It does end up changing the deck quite a bit. I think most of the Vileplume lists play a Greens engine in addition to Steven's Resolve to try and get their Rare Candies and Nest Balls early. Girafarig is another thing you could bear in mind for trying to get rid of some awkward things your opponent might try and loop with their own Orangaroos if you're concerned about something like Zoroark Control coming back into the format. And then there's the question mark of stadium cards, which I'm really not super sure about. Lysandre Labs and Lanakila both seem like they could be interesting one-offs to contend with, as is Wondrous Labyrinth as a Prism Star, but of course the Power Plant seems to be the most staple one that I've seen across the majority of these stalling variants overall. In at number 5, we have Blacephalon GX. I think the archetypes, gained a lot of traction after some very strong deep runs, even taking down a tournament of Ian Robb with his list. We've also seen a lot of interest around Zach Lesage's Persian GX build as well, to try and grab yourself those B strings on the key moment to do ridiculous damage against tag teams. That's why you're seeing it's got a favourable Reshizard. I also think it's got a pretty reasonable Zoroark. It always has done. I think there's maybe the question mark of like Slowking being teched into lists or Dugong being teched into lists, which does get a little awkward for Blounds, especially the Dugong in particular, which has seen a bit of an uptick in play actually with even off playing it recently. But I think on paper you're good against most Zoroark builds. I think you're pretty close against Shedinja and Stool, as I've outlined earlier. Unfavourables, I think Weezing's a little bit rough for you. I think Darkbox, Pikarom, and Zapdos are all relatively awkward as well. You can obviously tech for Pikarom by adding in a Mew to your list, and then they're forced to let you have B-strings, and then it's going to be more even. But I think, current renditions of Blounds is pretty weak against Pikarom, and QuagNag is the one thing that you really don't want to face. It's not very easy for you to use anything but your Blacephalon in that matchup. You'll have like maybe 1 or 2 turns of Naga at most, maybe using yours against theirs or whatnot, but you'll end up with a big deficit of energies all getting off your field, and then you'll be left with those Blounds anyway at some point, and your opponent can obviously uptrade against you, which is a little bit rough. So for my list, it's actually very vanilla baseline that's not playing Persian right now. I know I saw the consensus on the Hey Fonte group. Most people were thinking that Persian's the best way to go. Obviously, Persian does try and like lock down those tag team matchups a little bit more, guaranteeing B-strings on key turns. But I think the Muck for me is still too important. I think without a lower Muck, you really have no chance against Zapdos, which is a big loss to take, I think. So I'm still the fan of playing a lower Muck and giving yourself a chance against these Zapdos matchups. There are, of course, these other options. As I mentioned, Mew to help out Pikarom, Persian to help out against, kind of Pikarom, but also kind of Reshizard, just so you can hit those B-strings at the key moment. Of course, it's not only for B-strings, but, for helping out against these big tag teams, that's the main reason why Persian's there. Lysander Labs, we've seen Ian Robb play. Fire Flint and moving to a thicker welder line is an additional option you can try to help out against those tag teams. E-Switch is another one that I've omitted from my list. I didn't really like it as like a kind of random one-of in the list that I've seen, especially when you have Welder now to like give yourself additional attachments to your active. And the Ganadel GX is potentially a additional stalling tech card you could add into your list if you're really concerned about that matchup. So that's another thing you could try and add to your build. In at number 4, we have Zoroark Variants. Persian Silvally was the one that was the most voted for of the bunch, followed by Dugong, and then Slowking and Rock. Alongside Persian in all of these situations are also ones on people's radars. For favourables, I think you're pretty strong against Pikarom. For me, I'm going off of the most popular, like the most voted for build, which is Persian Silvally. I think the Silvally build is pretty favoured against Pikarom. It's very easy for them to knock out a Pikarom just by finding your fighting memory and a the good old triple acceleration in Silvally. Weezing, I think, is also a little bit favoured. You can heal off damage, which is always good. Reshizard, I believe, is close, especially the Silvally build, I feel is close because you're trying to mash together Kukui combos alongside the Silvally a lot of times, which makes it like an extra step compared to something like Pikarom. You obviously have your GX attack option available, but that's not always available depending on if they're a Greens build or if they're a Jirachi build. Shedinja, I believe, is close. You'll play Field Blower, you'll play Power Pad for Guzmas and whatnot. It's really down to them if they can memory melt stuff out of your hand. QuagNag, I also think, is pretty close. They have fighting tech cards, but you're going to kind of out-consistency them a lot of the time and just be putting that pressure on from the word go, and you're going to try and Field Blower and whatnot, make life rough for them. Try and lower Muck away their option to instruct and stuff like that. It seems pretty awkward for them. Zapdos, I believe, is still close. A lower Muck can have a big stranglehold on Zapdos at times, but they are oftentimes teched with fighting stuff. Blacephalon, I believe, is slightly unfavoured for you. You do have Persian now, which can be like a late game threat against them, and the Silvally obviously means you can try and trade with them a little bit easier, but usually they'll still be taking the first prize card, and it's hard for you to like skew the prize trade after that. You have to try and go through like 3 Blacephalon or 2 Blacephalon and a Lele if they are playing Lele or whatnot. Otherwise, they're usually going to try and uptrade and take an easy prize at some point in the game as well, which is a little bit rough for you. Unfavourable, I think Stall is one that you can tech for, but you're inherently weak against them. And Dark Box, I think. You can try and like a lower Muck to shut down their Spiritombs and whatnot, but the Honchkrow is the main issue here. The Honchkrow is something that you really can't play around unless you're playing like basic fighting energies. and a lot of the Zoroark builds, at least the ones I'm going to be showing you today, are purely based on special energies. And that's something that Honchkrow can completely lock down. Obviously, you can try and like Guzma a bunch of times, but as long as your opponent doesn't bench 6 prizes outside of the Honchkrow, like you're still going to end up losing that game. So the first build is going to be actually the top 8 list from Stefan Ivanov from this weekend's regional. Bringing Dugong to the table, I think, is not like a coincidence that it's come sort of back in popularity. The Dugong can definitely help answer Blacephalon GX, which has got a lot more popular. You can play around B-String, which is excellent for you to give yourself, actually, potentially with this list, a favourable Blounds matchup compared to the Persian Slowking builds. It's also got the nice like Giratina, cute tech card to maybe pick off some Jirachis or whatnot, which is a little bit cute. The Larvitar to give yourself some type coverage in mirror matches, as well as Pikarom. You can also see he's pretty heavily tech for Pikarom with that Mew in there as well. And pretty usual support account there. Tantalizer being chosen over Cynthia, which is like the only real standout card there. Devadfield was the stadium of choice. Brooklet Hill's also an option. Slowking is still an option, even if you're just going to play like a one-of, even just to ditto into. And there's, of course, the anti-stall text that you could be considering, the likes of... Again, he's already playing Tantalizer and Judge and Palpad and whatnot, so it's just something like the Oranguru himself, especially if there's less Giraffe Rig going into stall decks. You can get away with that now, which is pretty cool. Obviously, they have Faber and whatnot, so something to bear in mind. And then Great Ball's another card that you may think is a bit of a meme, but it's actually a card that I really like in Zoroark right now. Giving you some extra defense against Let Loose is a big deal, and just more options to find early Zoruas and other basics on turn 1, and finding obviously Zoroark on turn 2 is the cream of the crop. So Great Ball's actually a card that I really do relish in Zoroark to help pad out your deck and smooth over those opening turns, which is something to bear in mind. One thing that's interesting from Ivanov is that he actually played like a full 8 energies. I've normally sat at 7 in my like personal experience right now. So maybe that's a space that you can find in the list for one of these tech cards, but that's really the only space I can see from his build right now. Here's my favorite current build of Zoroark. It's actually the Silvally base build. I think having the both fighting and water memories in the deck gives you the best chance against Reshizard, because they have no safe haven of a tag team. You can uptrade on either the Eevee Snorlax or the Reshizard in combination with those Kukuis. So the Silvally really is a nice carry against those tag team matchups. Obviously fantastic against Pikarom. So as long as you can see through that kind of dodgy early game, especially when they're going to try and like let loose you a good amount of times, Zoroark is going to be very strong. You can see I have made the space for double Great Ball. This is literally my 60 card list at the moment, practicing with Zoro. In addition to those 4 Nest, 4 Ultra. I have cut a com for like that second Great Ball. You could have the 1 Ace Spec Great Ball if you really wanted to. It's not something that it's something that I have thought about, but at the moment I am choosing the Great Ball, like the second Great Ball over the 4th com, but that's just a little preference thing from me. I always try and weave in Great Balls into my Zoroark because I don't trust Lily enough, basically. For those other options, again, anti-stall text, if you want to have that Tantalizer Monkey kind of option, you can. I'm currently not playing Mew, which is something you could squeeze into the deck if you are worried about Pikarom. Personally, the Silvally is very, very aggressive against Pikarom, and I found it not a problem. It's, you know, you're not going to give them the option to tag bolt you with this build, in my opinion, so I think it's not something you have to be concerned with. And you may think this is another meme, but Gladion is also something that I've definitely considered in this deck. My losses to Reshizard have mainly come from prizing, you know, a memory card or like a second Silvally or a type null or something along those lines, and that can be very scary for you. There's also a lot of like important one-offs in the deck. There's Palpad, Blower, Acerola now is a one-of, Judge is a one-of, the Muck line, these are one-ofs, even Persian to an extent, so the deck is getting so tight because you're trying to tech for so many different things that Gladion is actually not ridiculous for grabbing some of these pieces. So that's one that I've actually genuinely considered in the deck, possibly even over the Cynthia, which is very bizarre, but something that I'm actually very much considering in my current Zoroark build. We get to the top 3 now, starting with Pikachu&Zekrom tag team. It's getting a lot of steam recently after Xander Pero and a few other guys had very strong placements with the deck. It's got a very strong Blacephalon and Shedinja in my eyes, especially if Blounds isn't playing Mew. It should be very, very strong for you I do imagine most of them will be adding a Mew to their list, though. Even said that said, though, you can still, Zapdos down their Mew early or whatever, and then just still try and skip Beast Ring. For close matchups, I think Stall, Weezing, QuagNag, and Darkbox, these are all kind of like reasonable. I think you can, use your field blowers against the Weezing and the QuagNag pretty effectively, and you can try and like tag bot through them at different points. Stall, I think you do have, a good amount of energy acceleration and some element of non-GX attackers in there as well. Darkbox, I think, is reasonable. Again, you can try and like Grinch down their Mew and get that big tag bolt value at some point in the game to really help you stay ahead. And you've got that early Zapdos pressure for, Spiritombs, and you can just try and Guzma them out. Your unfavorables, now this may be a little bit controversial, but I think he's fairly unfavorable against Zoroark. Again, I've made the assumption that it's the Silvally build, because that's the most voted for build. If it is like the Persian Slowking, that's definitely not the case. It'll be possibly even swung into Pika Rom's favor. Zapdos, I think, is slightly unfavored. There is always going to be a fighting element in Zapdos right now, whether it's the Beast build or it's just the sort of Marshadow Machamp build that we saw Michael Catron play to a top 4 finish. I think it was top 4, it may have been top 8. But yeah, I think there'll be always a fighting element in Pika Rom, and if they're going to add Mew, it's going to get really rough for them. And I think Reshizard is fairly unfavorable. If you're just going to play a test against the DDG successful list, you may find it to be somewhat of 50-50, but I can foresee, thanks to like an uptick in mirror matches, and now that Pika Rom is kind of more on the radar, I'm imagining Reshizard to be making spaces for Kukuis and Choice Bands. Even like Shrine of Punishment as one of could be an option in Reshizard. So I think that makes life much more difficult for Pika Rom. So I think your matchup is unfavored inherently. That being said, I'm just going to stick to the 60 card list that we saw from those guys. I really did appreciate their list. Maybe the flexible spots are things like the Stealthy Hood, whether or not you're still concerned about Vileplume. It does still help out against Weezing a little bit though. But I think that's the most flexible spot in the deck. Everything else is pretty reasonable. Absol, again, is something that could potentially be flexible. It's very good for Zapdos though. That's kind of why I'm keeping it there, but it's something that you don't get a lot of use out of in most other situations. For other options, the Jirachi base build did well over in Brazil, I believe it was. It may have been a Chilean regional, I can't remember. But that's done pretty well as well. Obviously, it won the EUIC pre-Unbroken Bonds, but we've seen sort of the standpoint that Jirachi can definitely help out a deck like this that's trying to work towards getting lots of Choice Bands and Electro Powers all at once, especially for that Reshizard matchup. Cynthia's a supporter that I've thought of, even just adding as a one-of in the deck could be reasonable, because there are those times when you're holding Ultra Ball and you want to Lele for something, but both Wagner and Lily are kind of weak options. A Wob effect could be creeping back into the deck. It's good for mirror matches, which is more relevant now, and it's going to help out your Zapdos matchup as, again, one of those things why Pika Rom did so well at the EUIC was the most successful lists were all adding Wob effect, so that you were far less worried about a Aero Trail, Dance of the Ancients kind of combo, and they just Tapu Thunder your first Pika Rom and things get rough from there, and they can just outrace you. So the Wob effect may be creeping back in if you're expecting enough mirror matches, and if you're expecting kind of an uptick in Zapdos once again, Wob might be worth the space. In at number 2, speaking of which, we are going to look at Zapdos Variants. It's the archetype that I'm still like infatuated with. I think it's my favorite build to play right now. Zapdos Beast was the most heavily voted for. Not much respect for the Jolteon build or anything else like that right now. Feels like most people are leaning towards that Rainbow Energy type train of thought. It's got a very good Dark Box, which is potentially like this new archetype on the block. Maybe it's not a big scalp to take right now, but it's something at the very least. You're also pretty good against Pika Rom, Blounds, and Shedinja, which is all good stuff. You're close against Zoroark. I think it's always been a back and forth. Something to bear in mind is I'm still a big advocate of Zeb Striker. Many of the Zap Beast lists that we saw early on in Unbroken Bonds sort of like stripped away Zebra to add in more basic tech Pokemon, but I think there will be an uptick in Zebra once again. Going back more traditionally to those builds that we saw successful, coming towards the end of the EUIC. QuagNag, I believe, is much closer now that you're playing Kukuis and whatnot, and Reshizard, I think, is also a close matchup for you. You have your Tapu Koko GX turn, and you have just early pressure from Zapdos. It's going to be great, especially if they're playing the Jirachi, like the Dene Lele type build. You have plenty of easy targets to take out throughout the entire game with Guzma, and possibly you only need to get through one Reshizard, which isn't a huge ask, to be honest. For unfavorables, you don't really want to see Weezing, and you definitely don't want to see Stall. These are the worst things that you can face as a Zapdos player. So first of all, we'll look at a Beast build. This is really close to the build I put on the channel just, I think, a couple of weeks ago now. I've upped the Zebraline to 2-2 because I'm just such a big fan of that card right now, giving you great defense against Zoro, even Blound's GX now that it's playing Alolan Muck a lot of the time, and giving you just digging potential in general with Sprint is always fantastic when you sometimes are put on a clock to find your Ultra Beast turns and to find your Coco GX at times as well is vital. You'll notice the biggest change really is the double Kukui in the list. Is kind of the biggest adaptation. So Thunderous Assault plus E-Power and Kukui can get you through these 120 hit point Pokemon, the QuagNags, the Weezings, the Volcanions in Reshi Greens. So that's all something to bear in mind. For other options, there's a plethora of things you could be adding into the list. A bunch of other non-GX attackers like Spiritomb, Kartana, Absol could help in mirror matches. Marshadow is a card that I'm actually not playing right now for Disruption. And Buzzmos is the big tag team you could try and add into the list as well to maybe help out mirror matches and other things playing Jirachi, because you can just get an easy beast game on something like that. And Volkner could still creep back into the list if you're not convinced by Kukui, or if you want to cut the Cynthias. It's a little bit risky, but Volkner can still help you grab those key like switching pieces or Electro Powers and whatnot in key moments. So it's a supporter that obviously I've liked in the past in the deck before there was a need for Kukui. But if you're not convinced, you can go back to Volkner's. Going to show off one more Zapdos build as well. Those same tech cards kind of applied from the last screen, but this is more like Katron's all basic energy based list that had the Buzzwole and the Marshadow Machamp. Obviously, this isn't playing Zeb Striker, but you're trying to make up for the fact that you aren't having that draw engine against the Zoroark by having a lot of brown stuff in your deck. The Marshadow Machamp being a really, really hard carry against Zoroark, which is excellent for you. Again, I'm adding in the double Kukui. I think it's just so vital right now. This one does have the Let Loose if you want to have that disruptive element to you. I think, again, you're pretty reasonable against Pikarom with that Mew and the fighting stuff. You're pretty reasonable against Zoro. And I think with the Tapu Koko GX, you're pretty much hoping that Reshizard overcommits at some point in the game, just having to Flare Strike or whatnot, and then you'll be able to Stellar Wish a bunch of times and work towards a big one-hit KO. Again, the Kukuis do help along that road as well. Even if you are just finding a way to take an easier knockout on non-GX stuff, like those Volcanions, if it is the green space build. So definitely something to bear in mind. Zapdos still very, very strong. Still good at prize trading. And I think it's kind of under the radar for the NAIC. Maybe it's getting a bit more traction. And I can actually see it being, possibly like the third or fourth most popular deck going into the NAIC, just because it's a pretty consistent non-GX attacking deck that I feel a lot of people are still comfortable playing. Seeing as though it had a really successful time in the team-up format. I feel like this will be a popular archetype and one that I wouldn't be sleeping on if I was going to the NAIC at all. I don't think I want to have a bad Zapdos matchup going into that tournament if I was going. And we come to number one. No surprise here, really. It's absolutely dominated recent tournaments. Reshiram Charizard Tag Team GX in both his forms, the Greens build and the Jirachi build, took up the first two spots of the votes from the general community. The consensus is that Reshizard is just absolutely nuts, and you can see why. I mean, its matchup spread looks pretty grim on paper, but bear in mind, like the other, like maybe even like the bottom 5 of this top 10 decks, they're all decks that try and have like good matchup spreads. So they're trying to target decks like Reshizard because they just know it'll be popular. So do bear that in mind. Possibly you'll be seeing that this matchup spread is like harsh. But I'll be trying to talk through it as we go down. Pikarom, I believe, is your natural favourable matchup. It's a good scalp to take, of course, dealing with the other tag team, especially now that you have extra damage modifiers in the deck. I think you're pretty close against Zapdos. You do need to try and be a little bit careful getting overzealous with Milk Tank, because you may end up having too many energies in play, and you can play into a Tapu Koko GX attack, which is pretty awkward sometimes. So remembering to like pay retreat before you like weld it to your Mill Tank is definitely something to bear in mind. And obviously, you oftentimes don't play Rescue Stretcher, so if they tackle the Milk Tank first, they can try and like two-shot through the Reshizard, which can get awkward for you as well. So these are things that I make you think it can get awkward for you, but at the same time, if you're having enough healing, and if you're the Greens build, I think you're actually a little bit favoured against Zapdos. Trying to make them go for an army of Baby Volks is actually really awkward. Zoroark, I think, is close. They're trying to... Well, I think the Silvally list is close. I think if they're just playing, like, Slowking or Dugong, I think Reshizard's pretty favoured because you just use the Eevee Snorlax to tear through them. But if they're playing Silvally, they have the options to knock out both, so I think it's close. Stall, I think, is also close, depending on your tech Pokemon of choice, and if they're playing, you know, Vileplume or Bronzong or whatever else. Weezing, I think, can be close. You oftentimes have a good amount of healing. You're a little bit weak against Blacephalon, as we've seen, especially if they're playing Persian. Things get a little bit rough for you. The best you can normally hope for is like letting loose on a turn you activate B-Strings. QuagNag, I think, is naturally a little unfavoured. You'll try and use the Eevee Snorlax as much as possible, or any of your non-Jex attackers. Dark Box, kind of similar story. You want to try and trade early while you can, let loose while you can and whatnot, but things aren't naturally that strong for you. And Shedinja is one that you really, really don't want to see. You oftentimes don't play more than like 3 Guzmas in the deck, and you rarely play more than 1 Field Blower, so life is going to be hard for you if you're facing Shedinja. We'll kick things off with the greens-based build. This is really similar to my teammate Bert's list that got second at a recent regional in Sweden. That happened this weekend, actually. I made only a couple of changes to the list. I added in an escape rope, I think, was the only thing I changed. I cut an Acerola for it, I think. Possibly 1 or 2 other changes here, but overall, yeah, I think really solid build. Oh, the other thing I changed was one Eevee Snorlax out for a rescue stretcher. It means that you can force your opponent to go through 5 Volcanions when you're up against Zapdos, and then you just drop a late tag team, and hopefully at that point they've run out of burst damage with like E-powers and even Kukuis and stuff like that. So that's the intention there. I'm more happy playing 2 Eevee Snorlax in the build that plays Kiawe, because the first Eevee Snorlax that comes on the board a lot quicker, whereas like if you're trying to use a second Eevee Snorlax in a matchup like against Zoroark or something, you absolutely need the first Eevee Snorlax to tank, so you have an extra turn to like Welder, or even turn attached to an Eevee Snorlax on the bench, which isn't always the case, especially if they're Silvally based, which is what I've found. But yeah, the 4 mixed herbs is the big sort of revelation that we kind of saw. I've seen both Pedro and Azul testing this on stream. I think it came from Pedro initially, and obviously it's been taken by Bert to a big finish now, so we're starting to see the dividends of that pay off. That's kind of the new tech card in the deck. I prefer it over Acerola for sure. The 1 max pot is still in the list. Still very helpful against like Weezing and stuff. And once again, Zapdos that are trying to like set up big 2 shots against you. So the fact that you can greens for that is still like a get out of jail free card at times. For other options, Acerola, Lieutenant Surge, kind of like Kiana Mini is like an original build, something that you could go for. Stealthy Hood as well. At the moment, this list is having no answer to Vileplume. Power Plant could come into this as well for more disruption against Zoroark players, especially shutting down Persian. Could also be very strong against Blacephalon decks trying to play Persian. Acrobike for just raw consistency, and Power Pad is actually a card that I've thought about adding into the list as well, just to help out against the likes of Shedinja and even stalling matchups, because you can Power Pad back Judge or Power Pad back Guzma. I think for those 2 options alone, I think it's more reasonable to add that in rather than just like one or the other of an additional card. Like, you want to play the 3rd Guzma and the 2nd Judge, but the Power Pad sort of fits both roles, I guess, is kind of the argument I'm trying to make here. And then finally, we have the Jirachi base build. Really, the changes I made from DDG's list is added in, as I said, Kukui, Band, and Blower. These are the cards that I think are like necessary things you need to make space for right now. One thing I cut was Arcanine. It might be something that you find necessary if you're expecting Vileplume. Additionally, you could try the Stealthy Hood out, which is just 1 deck slot. Shrine, again, could be like a nice mirror tech card, so that you can just find Choice Band Shrine for a knockout with Flare Strike. Also means that you have an easier way to knock out Pikaroms, which is reasonable. And also, there's the option for Escape Rope in the list right now. So far, it's just the 2 board and the 4 switch. Maybe weaving in 1 rope can get you out of some sticky situations. So definitely something to bear in mind as another option to have in the deck. So outside the top 10, I'm not going to go over these in too much detail, but here's a handful of other picks. If you were expecting any of them to be on the top 10, they've just fallen short based on the points they've earned this season. But in some cases, we've seen, glimmers of hope for these archetypes. Baby Blounds, Ultra Necrozma, Gramble, Vikavolt. Umbreon Hooper, Lapras Silvally, Nidoqueen Meganium, and Blissey Welder. They've all had sort of highlight reel moments at times, and in some cases they're sort of like cult favorites. So thought I'd mention them here. I think right now none of them really have the consistency to fall back on, which is why we're not seeing them at the top flight. I think for every one of these cases, it's consistency that's the biggest issue, apart from Gramble, actually. Gramble's the one that's like very consistent, but its matchup spread isn't phenomenal. Like, it doesn't want to face Stall, doesn't want to face Pikarom, and it's still got an awkward Zoroark, even though you're playing like Stealthy Hoods now. So I think it's Gramble's matchup spread that lets it down more than anything else, but for the rest of the crew, it's kind of their consistency reasons, which is why they're not higher on this list right now. They haven't proved themselves just yet. So where does that leave us? My couple of picks for the NAIC. If you want to have some fun, Spiritomb Honchkrow sounds like the way to go. It's a pretty fun rogue, and if you can dodge enough Zapdos, I think you could be okay with the deck. I could definitely see yourself making like a day 2 placement with it. That being said, I do rate Zapdos pretty highly right now, and it's still my favorite deck to play, so it is a risk at the best of times. And if you want to win games, Reshizard, man. Reshizard's just really, really strong. I really like the mixed herbs addition into greens, and it's making me look at that archetype all over again. I think if there is enough Zapdos, greens is the safer route. But if you want to just draw the best, obviously the Jirachi, Dedenne, Let Loose build is the one for you. So let me know what you guys thought about the top 10 list. Do you disagree with any of these choices? Where do you have your favorite deck? And where have I gone wrong in the list? I'll hear it all down below. Join the discussion. For now, though, good luck to everyone attending in Ohio. I will be watching from afar, and it's going to be great fun to really cap off this season. Because this is the last tournament before rotation, so we get the best times now, the final uses of Ultra Ball and Nest Ball, and we don't know how good we got it right now. Things are going to be changing pretty soon, so it's going to be a lot of fun. Cheers for watching, guys, and I'll see you in another video tomorrow.